Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, today we're going to be talking about radical architects and artists, strong women, queens and princes. As Britain digests the fairness, or otherwise, of the government's planned cuts and the big society. Josie Rourke's here to talk about a play she's directing at the National Theatre, set in the Glasgow slums of the 1930s, an embattled society, out of which came post-war idealism, which itself then ran into trouble, and is well represented by James Stirling, claimed by Alan Berman as one of the greatest architects of the century, a visionary whose buildings nonetheless infuriated some of those who used them. Later, we're going to hear from the historian David Starkey about his vision of the future, rooted, as you'd expect, in England's royal past, but reaching ahead to the next reign, and the one after that as well. First, though, back to Glasgow, through the eyes, words and brushes of one of its most devoted sons, the novelist and artist Alasdair Gray, author of Lanark, creator of murals and poems, book covers and posters. Alasdair, on the cover of one of your books, you have in gold the words, "Work as if you were living in the early days of a better nation." And much of what you have done is trying to create a stronger sense of part of the nation, a stronger sense of place.
Oh, good. I did not mean to. I just wanted to tell stories and make pictures that people would enjoy.
And yet, it's almost impossible to imagine your drawing and your writing without your native city. I mean, you seem to be as rooted in Glasgow, and Glasgow is as important for you as, you know, parts of Northern Ireland are for Seamus Heaney, or one could go on.
Yes, or St. Petersburg for Dostoevsky, or London for Dickens. Yes, I'm perfectly ordinary that way.
And yet, an awful lot of Britain, which, you know, we're endlessly discussing the big society at the moment in this country, but it seems to be very difficult to have a big society if you don't have a strong sense of place, strong sense of city, strong sense of your provincial or your local or your wherever it is you come from.
Well, D.H. Lawrence said, "All great art is local, all inferior art is provincial." By provincial art, he meant people who write as if they're explaining themselves to more important people. There's nothing more dull than the kind of writing.
And a pale copy of an art produced somewhere else, provincial.
Well, no, it can even be better than that. You can have a provincial art in which the writer is explaining, for instance, to give a horrible example, what Scottishness is. There's no such thing as Scottishness any more than there's a thing like Englishness or Americanness. There's only notions of un-Americanness or not British behaviour. Not really Scottish, to behave badly. No, I hate the notion of nationalness, because anybody who's any good at their art has learned from as many other countries and cultures as they can.
And where do you think your sense... I should say we're talking about this partly because you've produced a book called A Life in Pictures, which brings together a lot of your art, your graphic art, I should say, rather than your prose art, and the art of some of your friends who you feel have been undervalued or perhaps less well known than they ought to be. And the line, the very specific way that you draw, seems to have fixed itself pretty early on. I mean, you look at some of the posters and the book covers and so on that you were doing back in the 70s, and it's a very clear, very distinctive style. Where did it come from?
Partly from Walt Disney, partly from the Beano and the Dandy comics, but as I matured, increasingly from William Blake, from Aubrey Beardsley, and every other artist I've ever looked at and studied.
Because this is a book of pictures, and one of the very interesting parts of it is very early on you just show many of the illustrated books that you grew up with as a child. And it strikes me that we live now in a world of screens and television and so on, but the notion of gorgeously illustrated, carefully drawn and coloured books has rather fallen out of the culture, and this is a diminishment.
Yes. I can only agree with you, sir.
I'm going to start asking such long questions, and then we'll get longer answers. But no, just going back to the drawing style, because it is quite distinct. I just wondered whether a lot of these feel as if they'd been woodcut type drawings, very, very clear lines and lots of black space, and also drawings designed almost to be posters.
Well, some were posters, but I think one of the earliest books, I think I mentioned it in this one, but my father had a habit, and I now see him as a much more remarkable man than I ever thought when he was alive. He had a habit, when I asked questions which he couldn't answer, of getting books in order to provide the answers. It was amazing, and I think, not because I'd been given any religious education at all, I think at a very early age I asked him something about God. Who is this bloke? Being a Shavian socialist, he brought out and started reading to me Shaw's Black Girl in Search of God, which was illustrated by magnificent woodcuts. Now, I don't remember him doing that, reading it to me. He told me he'd later on, and I'd found it rather boring. No wonder at the age of 3. But at the age of 10 or 11, I found the book in the house, and at that time I was an avid reader, and I remember reading it and being very excited by it, and also by the woodcuts, because she looks quite sexy, this naked black woman, and I think that was a considerable influence on me.
And when you were growing up, and you were going to art college and so on, there's clearly a very distinctive, very busy Glasgow world of writers and artists. Many of them amateurs, many of them unable to make a living at what they're doing, but nonetheless meeting and talking and so on. And I just wonder whether that's faded away a bit these days. Well,
in the first place, I didn't think it was a very busy scene at all. I just knew a few folk who were, like me, trying to be painters, like me, writing novels. Not many, only Archie Hind, Betty Clark, the playwright, but largely ignored. And with no sense of assurance. Things have changed hugely in Scotland, certainly. We now have a thing we never had before, for which I'm glad. My friend James Gilman rather disparages it, but the fact that we've got now writers of detective novels that are read internationally. Yeah. You can have a Glasgow private eye detective who's read in America. Thinking, oh my God, that would never have happened. And then, of course,
so actually, things in many ways have improved since the 70s.
Oh, only for the writers and perhaps some of the artists. All the other industries have been destroyed.
Yes. Murals,
except tourism.
Except tourism, right? What did the rest of us make of this this work? Alan Berman.
I was fascinated by your comment towards the end of the book that some of the conventions that you were taught, which you despised when you were being taught, you now think should be revived. Can you expand on that?
It wasn't a convention that I was against at Glasgow School of Art. It was the basis of it was learning drawing. That was good. The first year, however, it had to be from plaster casts. I hated that. I had gone to Glasgow. Well, I wanted to draw bare naked women, and you weren't allowed life drawing until you got to your second year. That was fine, but all the teachers believed in drawing as the foundation of art, as all the Florentines did, you know. The Venetians had a looser attitude to it, but drawing, which Delacroix called the philosophy of art, drawing was the foundation of it. And we only thought our teachers in the drawing and painting department daft because they they thought art had gone bad with Cézanne and Gauguin and, Picasso certainly wasn't in it, but...
But nonetheless, the drawing, the learning to draw, hugely valuable, the eye and the hand.
Exactly.
The eye and the hand.
And nowadays, drawing and painting has become visual art, and we've had heads of visual art in Glasgow who tell students, you don't need to draw. I never learned to draw. You don't need to draw.
Obviously silly.
You
Fundamentally silly. Yeah?
Well, I think so.
Yeah. David Starkey.
Can we go, because obviously this book is also an autobiography, from art to life. I read it with interest because, although you're 11 years older than I am, 34, I was born 45, so much of your world was my world. I, too, was born into an aspirant working class. I, too, also had a family that was bookish, that took learning seriously, that even had pictures on the wall. But what struck me about I too had health problems. You had asthma, I had clubfoot, I had polio, and whatever. These curious stigmata which mark you. But what interested me was the completely opposite attitude that we had to origins. You've embraced them. You've essentially remained within the world of your childhood. I could not wait to get out. I remember sitting in my grammar school looking at the honours boards, those who'd gone to Cambridge and Oxford, and thinking, I am expletive. I even learned to swear for the moment. I am going to get out. You never felt that?
No, I never felt it.
But why? I mean, Glasgow's an interesting city, but it's not the world.
But he's made it the world. I mean, he's made it a kind of world. He's made it
his own world. But sorry, the Glasgow of the 18th century was a world city. The Glasgow of the early 19th century was a world city. I'm afraid the Glasgow of the mid-20th is provincial. It's a backwater. It's a backwater.
You were right. Scotland had provincialised themselves. The Scottish educational system, which had once been the best in the world, one of the best educational systems in the world, particularly for the working classes, was... By the early 20th century, the whole purpose of the Scottish educational system was to get jobs for the clever boys in England or the Empire. And that was why Robert Burns was never taught in schools, why the only Scott novel that was taught in schools was Ivanhoe, which describes how the Anglo-Saxons eventually assimilated by their Norman conquerors and became England. What a good lesson for Scottish schoolboys.
Isn't Glasgow infinitely more provincial now than it was in the first half of the 20th century? As you said, the only thing that connected it with the world was industry. It's now a mere state-subsidised backwater.
Well,
it's as bad as any other country in the world.
And thank
every other city in the world.
The hesitation halfway through that sentence. We're going to turn to Josie Rourke now, because it's absolutely apropos and straight on the money. Ina Lamont-Stewart, a Glasgow playwright of the 1940s, not very well known now, wrote this play called Men Should Weep, which was about Glasgow life in the 1930s in the tenements, and is an astonishing play and very, very tightly wrought. I mean, it's almost Ibsonian in its tightness. But it's about an awful lot of themes. We started off discussing the big society. It's about the pressure to get by on small amounts of money when you're looking after the elderly, granny in the corner, and too many children, perhaps.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's an interesting, just to pick up from what David was saying, in terms of Lamont-Stewart, who I think you knew, Alasdair, and her career. There's a question there, it seems to me, about the requirements of an artist to leave their home in order to be recognised, which seems to be underpinning what you were saying. And it's certainly the case with Ina Lamont-Stewart that she wrote this extraordinary play, Men Should Weep. It was a huge success. It gave an account. I mean, she was not a working-class girl. She was a daughter of a manse, actually. Her experience of life in the tenements was drawn from working as a hospital receptionist and having seen mainly women come in with children with TB, as appears in the play, and huge amounts of poverty, and also from her father's ministry, I think. But after this play, she disappeared and was largely forgotten, something not unknown, particularly of women playwrights at that time. I mean, if we think of Sophie Treadwell in America or, Gita Sauby, they did tend to write one great play and then disappear.
Which is really frustrating because you can see here, this is somebody who could have, you almost feel it's like an early Arthur Miller play. This is somebody on the way to real greatness.
I think that's right. And
then she stops.
Yeah, she does stop. I mean, she continued to write, but what she certainly didn't have was the correct forms of encouragement. Seems to be the general perception. I mean, I don't know, perhaps Alasdair could add something to that, but it was it's an extraordinary play in terms of its scope. It's very like a Miller play. It's both a piece of exquisite social realism in terms of how brilliantly it's observed, but there are also these huge themes running through it. And the other thing that's wonderful to do, because having directed a lot of classical plays, is when you see the curtain call, you get an almost exact reversal in terms of the gender balance, where you normally have 14 blokes and about 4 women. In this instance, it's 14 women and about 4 blokes, which is just an incredible thing to see on the little stage, frankly.
Do the London audiences struggle with the language?
I think that it takes them a while. It takes them a while to tune in.
The cast are Glaswegians, aren't they?
Largely Glaswegian. I mean, they range from across Scotland, and again, an interesting balance of actors who've left Scotland in order to work, or actors who've remained there working in the very vital theatre scene. But it takes a short while to tune in, I would say. But like any play, I mean, like a Soyinka play or a Shakespeare play, your ear has to become attuned both to the dialect and also to the Scots that sits within it. The opening scene is with Granny, so obviously she's got more old Scots in her language than the mum has.
And at a time when we're talking about the need for the big society, in other words, people to take on more of the burden and less and leave less to the state, I suppose this also points out how hard this can be, what a hard life it is, caring in different directions and different generational
I think that's right. And of course, one of the great things that plays can do, as well as being great literary documents, is they can be great physical documents. So what you see, and she's very brilliantly dramatised in this play, is the told that looking after children and looking after the elderly and working in, without all the modern devices we have these days, but working to raise a family, the toll that takes on a woman's body. Is very vividly realised, and because we've got this large stage in the Littlesome, what we've done is we've portrayed both the room that she originally wrote, and there are in total sort of slices of 8 other tenement rooms that you can see as you look at the stage, and to be able to populate that and to think about what that whole life would have been like, and the kind of mutuality and support and the gossip and the difficulty of living cheek by jowl. Yes. It's really fascinating.
There was a famous Scottish book called No Gods and Precious Few Heroes, and in many respects this seems to be a play about that. It's a play about weak men in many ways and strong women, isn't it? Well, or stronger women.
Yeah, I mean, I'd counter that slightly, I think, Andrew. I think it's about how poverty emasculates men, so that when there isn't enough work for this great kind of patriarch figure to take on, what happens is that he's systematically sort of plucked away at by the different forces in the play. And what you have in terms of the portrayal of women is a series of the different roles that women take on. There are mothers in that play. There are women who have decided not to get married and to, work in it. There's the sister who works in a pub. There's a girl who everyone thinks is really tarty but actually is living on her wits. You can see this great range of opportunities. Well, I say great range, there's about 4 or 5. And then all of them on some level work on this father figure to try and emasculate him, be it the daughter-in-law trying to seduce him, or the mother eventually attacking him, or the sisters sniping at him for, engaging and chatting on street corners about why there are no jobs, rather than...
And the world of the slums, because it was such a leprous, poverty-infested place, became a world that the next generation wanted to sweep away physically. The tenement buildings almost all went. And now, of course, the few that are left have become sort of tarted up and very expensive and places to go and admire. But it was a world that generation, actually Ina Lamont-Stewart's generation, were determined to erase forever.
Well,
Alasdair Gray's shaking his head, but I'll let you answer first before Alasdair Gray's shaken head returns.
And again, it's wonderful to have Alan here to talk about this as well, because it seems to me from the reading that I've done, from talking to people, they didn't want to sweep away the architecture. They wanted to sweep away the poverty, and they wanted to sweep away the overcrowding. There wasn't something rotten in the state of Denmark. Actually, what was, in terms of the buildings, what was wrong was the conditions and the overcrowding in which people were forced. And the alternative was certainly something that's a great sadness that lives on in Glasgow to this day.
Well, except that those tenements did go, and they were replaced by big estates like Castlemilk and so on, built after the war.
This was everywhere. The whole, it was everywhere. It's not just Glasgow. Even the little northern town that I grew up in Kendal, destroyed magnificent 17th century yards because they were claimed as slums. And throughout Britain, there was a conspiracy between two people in every town. One of them was the surveyor, the town surveyor, and the other was the borough medical officer of health. And between them, they created a desert and built a council estate. And they are hideous, destructive places that have recreated a poverty every bit as, I would argue, worse than what the play describes, because it's a poverty of the spirit as much more than a physical poverty.
Alan Berman.
I'm very glad to hear you say that, David, because usually the accusation is against the designers of the houses, the architects, but actually this was the medical officers who saw that they needed to erase this past, these slum houses, and actually it was about poverty, failure of aspiration, and all failure of opportunity. And I think there's
But it was medicalised.
Yes.
It was classically medicalised.
Yes.
So the disease was attached to the building.
Alasdair Gray.
I wouldn't blame the medical officers too much. You're wrong about saying all but a few of the Glasgow tenements were destroyed. The point is most of the Glasgow tenements were built for the middle classes. They were built bigly and spaciously. They became slums. They became slums in the Gorbals, for instance, simply because with the expansion of the industry, people moved out of them into posher places outside, and slum landlordism came in. So you'd whole families first living in one room, and then families living each in a corner of one room. And of course, since the landlords were not maintaining them properly, you had hideous slum conditions growing up. The best Glasgow tenements, which had 5 rooms and kitchens or more, still stand.
They're mansion flats. They're elegant mansion flats.
They are elegant mansion flats. They still survive. The trouble was that Glasgow City Council, Labour from almost the late 30s, continually up till now, alas, because any party that's in power for very long becomes corrupt. They were actually persuaded by mainly English publicity, the Gorbals story, Glasgow tenements, ugly, nasty, insanitary, and many of them really had grown up in these insanitary conditions. John Wheatley, a miner's son, growing up with a hideously overcrowded big family, Catholic, it was he who brought in the Wheatley Act.
The Housing Act, yes, absolutely.
That would enable local housing to build houses for folk that private landlords wouldn't or couldn't build. As a result, of course, but they first built Knightswood and Ridley, where I grew up, which were actually very posh, successful council estates. We all felt really posh there, living in them, because they'd public libraries, municipal bowling greens.
And quite right, too.
And the later ones didn't have them. Sorry.
We're going to move on now to somebody whose idealism and whose sort of sense of a possible better future came out of this world, in a way, didn't it, Alan Berman? I mean, Jim Sterling was one of the post-war visionaries.
Well, he was a post-war visionary in terms of his belief in architecture as something that could be significantly improved. What he saw, he did not design much housing at all.
But
what he saw was a rather polite, and I think rather similarly to the play, to Men Should Weep. The architects in London and around the Festival of Britain time were building what has been described as a rather Scandinavian, rather tame, a lot of international style buildings, not a lot of interest in terms of architectural form. And James Sterling was one of the, you might say, the equivalent of the angry young men who said that it was time to look back to the heroic period of modernism, pre-war modernism, whereas in England it had become rather tame, the international style. And he saw an opportunity, or he saw the need, rather, to develop architectural forms which were much more exciting and much less banal. And to that extent, he looked to the earlier moderns, and he looked to Europe for that.
And in reviving interest in his work, looking particularly at his work, you've produced a book about his Red Trilogy. Explain to us what the Red Trilogy was and is.
The Red Trilogy are 3 buildings for Leicester, Oxford and Cambridge universities, which he and initially his partner James Gowan developed using a language which they saw as a vernacular, and that's very important. They were interested in the vernacular, but it was the industrial vernacular of red tiles, red bricks, which was the northern engineering bricks that he saw when he grew up in and around Liverpool, and very cheap patent glazing. And that was quite an adventurous set of forms, set of materials that he used. After the war, there was a tremendous optimism about building with new materials, building in new ways, and in fact we see that optimism in for example, the design of the Mini and a lot of other things. And and those 3 buildings he designed were absolutely groundbreaking.
And you make the point in the book that whereas Isigonis designing the Mini can keep redrawing it and fiddling with it, and because the very first versions of the Mini had all sorts of design problems with them, and they let the water in and they were rusted and all the rest of it, or indeed where an artist or a writer can constantly revise what they're doing until it's ready, an architect has only one go. Up goes the building, right or wrong, and of course many of James Stirling's buildings in technical terms did not go well. I mean, they dripped and there were condensation problems and...
Indeed, they were
I sat under the drops
in the history library.
Cambridge.
Well, indeed, I make the point that clearly I wouldn't for 1 minute pretend that there weren't technical problems. There were. The point is exactly the one you've identified that I write about in the book, is that no artifact, no constructed artifact gets made apart from buildings which have to perform on their first go, whether it's a car or a toaster or any other artifact. It's it's road tested, or even a play.
There is a real conceptual mistake here, which is they always used to be very important temporary buildings that went up very quickly and came down very quickly. And it seems to me that where we've gone wrong is that the idea of architectural experiment is all very well, but it is now combined with a false monumentalism. The sort of building that I was referring to there were legion types. There were the great exhibitions. There were the temporary pavilions of great exhibitions. There were stage sets. There were entertainment.
But David, I can't accept that because many Gothic cathedrals fell down because they were built too high, and many examples of great architecture in the past have failed. The only ones we have left now are the ones that have been
successes.
No, they've been patched and repaired, and every 50 years or so, which is what is happening to Stirling's buildings now. They're 45, 50 years old. They are renovated, and I see in Oxford colleges, where I do a great deal of work, that every 40 or 50 years there is no question that they need to be repaired, stonework needs to be repaired, roofs need to be replaced. But when this has to happen to a building of the mid-60s, people get on their high horse and say these buildings don't work. But most buildings don't work because they become out of date.
It's simply tosh. I mean, that was a building that was designed not to function. It was supposed to be a building with lecture rooms. The lecture rooms were deliberately designed with butt-jointed glass between them, which means if you're a lecturer like me with a powerful voice, the people next door were hugely improved by listening to my lecture rather than the tedium to which they were being exposed. There was a library which was beautifully modelled on a 19th century prison, that's to say a panopticon, with the great problem being that not only was the librarian at the axis of the panopticon, so was the place that you entered, so nobody could actually read anything. This is a building which is pure exercise of form over function.
But you see, that's entirely wrong. I'm sorry.
Let Alan Berman come back.
Well, I was talking
you never experienced it.
I was talking to a historian last week who spent 4 years researching there, and he said he came from a school where reading history was really considered, not the done thing. Most of his friends were going into the works, into factory jobs, and he came to this shining, bright, brilliant crystalline building, and he absolutely loved being in the reading room because that reading room was at the heart of the history faculty. Now,
nobody's ever researched in that. It's a
Can I jump
faculty
in?
library.
I want to just jump in here and ask about the way architecture is done, because I think it's an interesting question here as to the balance between the purity of the architect in front of his drawing table, looking at his forms and looking at the new materials which are available to him, and the amount of time an architect should spend, as it were, with the client, walking around, thinking, talking to the client before drawing.
Well, the architect has to do both. It's an incredibly complex and elaborate process. And if you look at the way Jim Sterling's 3 red buildings are organised, they're very, very well organised. The idea
you can't move in the corridor.
The idea, it was Geoffrey Elton, your colleague, historian, who actually championed that building, because he and other people on the jury who judged Sterling and Gowan's submission at that time, thought that the idea of putting the library at the heart of the history faculty with the academic rooms around it was absolutely a brilliant concept. And
Elton was a demented ideologue as well.
That's an area I don't want to get into.
Alasdair Gray.
No, I was just going to say, wasn't there a reading room of the British Museum
There was indeed.
Panopticon devised?
But you didn't enter. You didn't enter. The librarian sat at the heart of the Panopticon, but you didn't enter in the middle. You entered quietly from the side and crept round the great desks. And also,
Isn't there another question here, though, that what happens when a new building and a radical, aggressive building goes up, or a building that challenges you, is everybody who uses it thinks about the building. Whereas when we're using traditional buildings, an Edwardian lecture room and all the rest of it, somehow we're conditioned not to think about the building.
I've never been in an
we're
Edwardian lecture room that leaked. I've never been in an Edwardian lecture room where I could hear the lecture next door more clearly than the one that I was supposed to be. And your point about medieval cathedrals is a sliver. The medieval cathedrals worked devotionally. In other words, they fulfilled their function. They might have had problems about the form, about the ambition of the architecture, but no medieval cathedral failed as a place of worship. What I'm saying is the history faculty fails fundamentally, totally and absolutely as a proper academic building.
But that's your view. I've met academics that actually disagree and consider it a wonderful place to work.
Are you then suggesting I should be silent about
No, I'm not for one moment.
I don't think anyone's suggesting, David, that you're going to be silent about your views is remotely likely to succeed.
And heaven knows I don't want to try and cut into your clearly very traumatic experience of being leaked upon, but there is an interesting question here, I think, about the right to fail in detail but to progress in experiment, which is fundamental to my craft and experience. I run a theatre that's dedicated to the production of new plays, and we have as many failures as we do successes, but the project is critical. One of the most interesting things about your book is the collection of essays from other architects talking about the conditions of inspiration, really, that are required and that seem to have been supplied by Sterling.
Yes, one of the essays points out that one of the marks of a classic is that years and years later it can be revisited and subject to controversy. And it's very clear that architects of a whole range of outlooks and generations see in these radical buildings of Sterling's that they are full of ideas. They're extremely rich. I don't for 1 minute
let's move on from the practical stuff is really boring. Another thing that I thought was a real problem about your book was the notion that the proper judge of architecture is another architect. It's this mysterious, as it were, professionalisation. The proper judge of architecture is the consumer, is the viewer, is the person who pays for it.
You would want to be judged, would you not, by other historians as much as by your readers, or
I would want to be judged much more by my reader, and I write deliberately for my reader, not for my jealous professional rivals.
Well,
do you feel that the architecture of the building in Oxford, Cambridge, has really set British history back by destroying the capacity of the lecturers and the students to become historians?
No.
Oh, good.
Right. On which point we'll move on to history and to David Starkey's own book, Crown and Country, which is looking at the mere 2,000 years or so of the monarchy in England. David, rather disconcertingly, you start this book, however, with the Romans and the departure of the Romans, which you see as a crucial break point in the history of this part of the world. Why is that?
I think because we are unique in the Western Empire. That's to say, Britannia was, we don't quite know how many, a collection of provinces of the Roman Empire. But elsewhere in Western Europe, Spain, France, Italy, although Rome fell, Romanists didn't. In Spain, it's very remarkable, although you had not simply one, but two massive invasions. You have the Gothic invasions, followed immediately by the Islamic invasions, and yet the elements of the language survive, traditional urban centres survive, patterns of agriculture and so on survive. In Britain, in Britannia, they are absolutely obliterated.
Yeah.
Lines of...
I've just come back from Toulouse, and the central square is still called the Capitol.
It's called the Capitol. You've still got squares, which are essentially fora. And I think this has utterly profound effects on language, on attitudes to authority and power, but also, I think, if I dare use the word English, one of the very peculiar things about being English is this fundamental nostalgia and sentimentalism. And I think part of it is our awareness that we obliterated something greater. You can read the early Anglo, you can read in Bede and whatever, and there is a sense that there was a great world there.
The Roman
baths.
The wonderful poem about going to Bath, the Anglo-Saxon poem, and this must have been made by a race of giants.
By a race of giants, because of course then, they look, not as they do now, terribly gentilized in the 18th century. You would still have had a roof like the baths of Caracalla. I mean, you're talking about experimental architectural structures, which indeed eventually fell down, though after having stayed up neglected for about 700 years. Much better than Stirling, though using the same materials. So I think there is that. That was one of the things I was trying to get at. So the encounter between the English and indeed the Scottish and classicism, which is one of the great stories of art you're talking about, the classical, is different here. It's a different encounter. In a France or a Spain or an Italy, they're recovering their own past. Here we're colliding cultures.
What worries me about that is this notion that there is... you talk about the looking back and the sentimentalizing and the romanticizing the past. One of the concerns as an architect is that we're in a culture in England where anything old is preserved, and everything new is to be despised or to be berated and experimented.
That's nonsense. Look at the revolutionary change of fashion in interior design, the worship of the contemporary interior.
Tell me about Prince Charles and Poundbury.
Well, because we've got different sets of values. We're a wonderfully conflicted and arguing society, which is one of the great virtues of England and Britain.
Through this, sorry, I just want to come back to the narrative of monarchy first, then we can go back off again. But through this book, you make the argument that actually a lot of the sort of central thrust of English civilization is connected to the monarchy in different ways, and it's a long and complicated history. I just wanted to jump. Prince Charles was mentioned just now. Jump right into the contemporary world and ask how you think, first of all, history is going to judge the present Queen, and talk a little bit about your enthusiasm for a new reign as well, and a new way of a reimagining of monarchy.
I think the present Queen will be judged very favourably in that she hung on and survived and stayed the same. I think she'll be judged unfavourably for precisely the same reasons, that she stayed the same. And that, of course, the world that she evoked, remember, she's been on the throne, she's about to be the longest reigning monarch, she's just coming up to it. She came to the throne in 1952, and in 1952 she was already old-fashioned. She was consciously looking back to her father and her grandfather. I must be one of the very few people, apart from the Duke of Edinburgh, who largely wrote them, that has ever read all the Queen's Christmas broadcasts. And her only frames of reference is not Elizabeth I, is not William the Conqueror. It's to George V and George VI.
Who created the Windsors.
Who created the House of Windsor, which she sees herself as the embodiment of. But those values of the 50s and those values of the 20s, 30s, 40s are infinitely remote.
And Prince Charles?
Prince Charles is clearly trying to do something different. He couldn't keep on doing the same thing because the failure of his marriage was what finally broke the old Windsor monarchy, which was essentially a family worship. I call it English Shinto. It's a very English thing, of course, despite the Scotticism of Balmoral and whatever. It's the English worshipping themselves through the King Emperor and their common institution of bourgeois family marriage, sounding like a Marxist. But anyway, it's sort of more or less true. Charles, of course, couldn't do that because of him and Diana. And what he's obviously experimenting with, and as usual, being a little bit ahead of the curve. Look at his ecology, look at his doubts about industrialised medicine, about agriculture, genetically modified food. He's always, in a funny way, very old-fashioned on the one hand and rather ahead of things on the other. And he was already talking about most of the elements of the big society long before, Johnny-come-lately David Cameron got round to it.
I can't disagree with that. And it is fascinating that somebody from that background can look at some of the cultural things that he's doing in alternative medicine. But, of course, for me as an architect, he's
a disaster.
He's a disaster. Yeah. Well, I'm delighted to hear you say that. I think that's probably one of the things I wanted to hear you say, and I didn't think I would.
No. I am the least naturally conservative of people. I'm a Thatcherite radical. There you are. Alasdair can get cross with me.
Josie.
No, I take it for granted. You belong to the majority nowadays.
I was fascinated just to draw a line through. You write about Victoria reviving her reputation through re-engaging with pageantry. And I'm just interested in this new model of the monarchy, what kind of pageant you think Charles may present.
Knows. It's unbelievably difficult. You see, in the late 90s, particularly the earlier 20th century, history provided, again, talking about historicist styles, it provided, as it were, a legitimation. So what you do is you consciously revive, bizarrely, at the great moment of the triumph of democracy in Britain, you consciously revive the whole medieval pageantry. Yes. The next coronation can't be like that. We no longer have an hereditary peerage. That's half of the cast. You're a producer. That's half of the cast of characters gone. The other half is in deep doubt because of the widespread contempt that hangs over the Church of England. Who will be there to crown? In the name of what will he be crowned?
Well, my cast of characters haven't gone, but they have gone out of time or run out of time. Thank you to all my guests. That was great fun today. Josie Rourke's production of Men Should Weep is on at the National Theatre in London. David Starkey's Crown and Country, A History of England Through the Monarchy is out now, as are Jim Sterling and the Red Trilogy, edited by Alan Berman, and Alasdair Gray's Autopictography, A Life in Pictures. Next week, reputations are at stake as Deborah Cadbury looks back at her family's firm and the chocolate wars. Stephen Isserlis stands up for Saint-Saëns, and we'll be discussing Ireland's financial woes and immigration with Fintan O'Toole and Nick Bowles. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Alasdair Gray, author of Lanark, creator of murals and poems, book covers and posters. Alasdair, on the cover of one of your books, you have in gold the words, "Work as if you were living in the early days of a better nation." And much of what you have done is trying to create a stronger sense of part of the nation, a stronger sense of place.
Oh, good. I did not mean to. I just wanted to tell stories and make pictures that people would enjoy.
And yet, it's almost impossible to imagine your drawing and your writing without your native city. I mean, you seem to be as rooted in Glasgow, and Glasgow is as important for you as, parts of Northern Ireland are for Seamus Heaney, or one could go on.
Yes, or St. Petersburg for Dostoevsky, or London for Dickens. Yes, I'm perfectly ordinary that way.
And yet, an awful lot of Britain, we're endlessly discussing the big society at the moment.
Disney, partly from the Beano and the Dandy comics, but as I matured, increasingly from William Blake, from Aubrey Beardsley, and every other artist I've ever looked at and studied.
Because this is a book of pictures, and one of the very interesting parts of it is very early on you just show many of the illustrated books that you grew up with as a child. And it strikes me that we live now in a world of screens and television and so on, but the notion of gorgeously illustrated, carefully drawn and coloured books has rather fallen out of the culture, and this is a diminishment.
Yes. I can only agree with you, sir.
I'm going to start asking such long questions, and then we'll get longer answers. But no, just going back to the drawing style, because it is quite distinct. I just wondered whether a lot of these feel as if they'd been woodcut type drawings, very, very clear lines and lots of black space, and all
notions of un-Americanness or not British behaviour. Not really Scottish, to behave badly. No, I hate the notion of nationalness, because anybody who's any good at their art has learned from as many other countries and cultures as they can.
And where do you think your sense... I should say we're talking about this partly because you've produced a book called A Life in Pictures, which brings together a lot of your art, your graphic art, I should say, rather than your prose art, and the art of some of your friends who you feel have been undervalued or perhaps less well known than they ought to be. And the line, the very specific way that you draw, seems to have fixed itself pretty early on. I mean, you look at some of the posters and the book covers and so on that you were doing back in the 70s, and it's a very clear, very distinctive style. Where did it come from?
Partly from Walt.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, today we're going to be talking about radical architects and artists, strong women, queens and princes, as Britain digests the fairness, or otherwise, of the government's planned cuts, and the big society. Josie Rourke's here to talk about a play she's directing at the National Theatre, set in the Glasgow slums of the 1930s, an embattled society, out of which came post-war idealism, which itself then ran into trouble, and is well represented by James Stirling, claimed by Alan Berman as one of the greatest architects of the century, a visionary whose buildings nonetheless infuriated some of those who used them. Later, we're going to hear from the historian David Starkey about his vision of the future, rooted, as you'd expect, in England's royal past, but reaching ahead to the next reign, and the one after that as well. First, though, back to Glasgow, through the eyes, words and brushes of one of its most devoted sons, the novelist and artist in this country. But it seems to be very difficult to have a big society if you don't have a strong sense of place, strong sense of city, strong sense of your provincial or your local or your wherever it is you come from.
Well, D.H. Lawrence said, all great art is local, all inferior art is provincial. By provincial art, he meant people who write as if they're explaining themselves to more important people. There's nothing more dull than the kind of writing.
And a pale copy of an art produced somewhere else, provincial.
Well, no, it can even be better than that. You can have a provincial art in which the writer is explaining, for instance, to give a horrible example, what Scottishness is. There's no such thing as Scottishness any more than there's a thing like Englishness or Americanness. There's only